So the sociology of depression is what we're going to be talking about, not the psychology or biology of it, but the sociology, because I am trained as a sociologist. Of depression is known to be in ancient Egypt, probably by the multi-genius Imhotep, architect, philosopher, priest, who probably wrote the papyri or papyrus on melancholy and identified it as a state of sadness without cause, a state of loneliness, a state of helplessness. The Egyptians explained that this is probably because of an imbalance in the bodily fluids, especially the bodily fluid that is related to the earth. The earth fluid in the body might be excessive or inadequate, and that could lead the person to become depressed or melancholic. This was about 2,500 to 3,000 BC, and that is 5,000 years ago when Africans identified this mental illness as a form of sadness without cause, or loneliness, or helplessness. 2,500 years later, the ancient Greeks, who were educated in Egypt, borrowed some of these ideas from Egypt. And Plato writes a lot about, for example, about melancholy, and identifies some of his disciples who were suffering from it, and learned from ancient Egypt how to deal with it. But the Greeks and the Romans then added that what causes melancholy is what they call black bile or black humor, and they added the word or code black to it, probably to identify it with a state of darkness or hopelessness, and maybe that's the origin of the use of black in European thought to represent negative things, whereas the Egyptians, who were black, would not have regarded anything black as necessarily negative. Cheikh Anta Diop theorizes that Europeans borrowed African discoveries in medicine, in science, in philosophy, in mathematics, in astronomy, in architecture, and therefore we should be careful not to dismiss any ideas coming out from Europe as foreign to Africa, because when we look closely, we will see that they borrowed those ideas from Africa in the first place. In the Elizabethan era, Shakespeare presented some of his characters, such as Lady Margaret, Hamlet, King Lear, and others, are suffering from depression. The New Zealand Maori legal theorist Moana Jackson shares the story of when he was in high school and his teacher wanted him to write a review of King Lear, and he found that King Lear was suffering from a form of mental illness that we may call depression today, and he concluded his essay by saying that this proves that nothing has changed in the royal family, and for that he was summoned to the staff room and criticized for not having a title for his paper, but he got A. The first or earliest theorization from a sociological point of view of depression comes from Karl Marx. Prior to Marx, the depression or mental illness was explained mainly by reference to biology, or what is known as biological determinism. But later came psychological determinism, Karl Marx was probably one of the first to identify sociological determinism. In other words, according to Marx, there is nothing wrong with people who are mentally unwell, people who are suffering from depression. What we should be asking is, what kind of society is it that drives people to become depressed? And the word Marx used here was alienation. What kind of society organizes work in such a way that the worker is alienated from the fruits of his labor? You produce, but you cannot afford the fruits or the produce from your labor, because the person who owns the means of production accumulates, expropriates the surplus value produced by the worker, and so the worker is alienated not only from the product but also from the labor process. This can lead to depression, but according to Marx, when the workers are organized and demand to make a revolution to change the society for the better, then they will not be suffering from alienation. They will be doing something positive to change the world. According to him, philosophers have explained the world in many different ways, but the point is to change it, to reduce or eliminate alienation or mental illness or depression. Emile Durkheim, a French sociologist, disagreed with Marx about alienation because he saw industrialization as a positive thing. Marx also saw industrialization as a positive thing, but Marx identified internal contradictions within capitalist industrialization and predicted that the workers who are alienated, being the majority, would unite and form a political party that will overthrow the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and thereby increase human happiness and human well-being. But Durkheim said that that's too theoretical or too far-fetched, because to him, what he called anomie will always be a part of human society. Anomie is a state in which what you expect is not what you experience. When your expectations do not match your experience, according to Durkheim, there will be anomie. Durkheim would agree with Marx that people who are going through anomie, there is nothing wrong with them as individuals. Rather, there is something wrong with their society. A society where people have expectations that are not matched by their experience. For example, you elect a government and the government does not meet your expectations, then there will be what Durkheim calls anomie. Marx would say it's not anomie as such, because anomie translated into English means normlessness, and there is no such thing as a society without norms or ways and means of doing things. So it isn't really anomie from the point of view of Marx. It is alienation, and this alienation is a term that is used more commonly by psychologists, because psychology, for example, says that people suffering from depression or mental illness are aliens, and psychiatrists who treat them are called alienists. So the word alienation is actually more central to the discussion of depression than anomie. But I'd like to mention Thomas Merton, who was a Catholic priest, and he stated in one of his essays that people are always afraid of people with depression or mental illness, because you never know what the mad person was going to do. But according to Merton, when you pause to think about it, you find that the people who ever hurt you in your life, or people who committed genocide in your society, people who waged war against your society, were never really insane. They were the normal people who could sit down in their offices and plot how to kill millions of people, and you think they are joking, but they go ahead and put the plan into motion. According to him, crazy people are too busy being crazy to plan how to exterminate millions of people for whatever purpose. So we should be more skeptical about people in power rather than people who are alienated from society and excluded from society on account that they suffer from depression. W.B. Du Bois also contributes a sociological theory of mental illness by looking at what he called the souls of white folk. And according to him, white folks are driven crazy by the ideology of white supremacy and by the greed for colonies through which they can expropriate maximum wealth from the colonized. They also envy each other, and this envy drives them to begin a tribal war among Europeans that they call the World War. But they did not know that World War I was going to be the last World War. They thought it was going to be the war that ends all wars. Du Bois told them in 1920 that because you people are still fighting over colonies in Africa, you are going to have another world war. And 20 years later, that came to pass. Du Bois is saying that kind of thinking makes Europeans, well, crazy.